Welcome to my show, When Everyone Wins, where a key goal I have for you is shifting from power over and under to power within and between. I'm your host, Judy Ryan. In each episode, I'll share my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder and CEO of LifeWorks Systems. I'll help you build trust and emotional and social intelligence. My show, When Everyone Wins, is about creating a life you love and helping others do the same. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's episode. Our episode is called How a Commitment to an Enlightened Bottom Line Ensures That Everyone Wins. I'm really excited to bring you an amazing and very important and accomplished guest on my show today. Before I introduce her and read her bio to you, I want to connect the dots as to why she's so vital to my intention for this show, When Everyone Wins. She embodies what I mean when I say we must shift power over and power under to power within and power between. I met my guest after reading a book called Crossing the Desert by Payam Zamani. The book is a true story about a successful young entrepreneur who founded an innovative tech business in the United States that rose quickly, and it went public when the founder was 28 years old and had an IPO of over $1 billion. However, what was so powerful to read was how that business, like many others, was not sustainable financially, nor did it serve the highest values or fill the greatest gaps that it could, because profit and the desires of stakeholders quickly became the highest priority, which ultimately stifled the creativity and long-term success of a great idea, a great entrepreneur, and a great business. Eventually, Payam founded an organization called One Planet Group, where people, purpose, and principles were restored as number one. In researching One Planet Group, I stumbled across my guest today, who it turns out is an amazing and accomplished person in her own ways, in ways I never dreamed. I'm still pinching myself that I found her and that I've gained her agreement to be on my show. Before I read her bio, which is very impressive, I ask you to consider these questions. What happens when a commitment to ethical and spiritual beliefs and practices required for win-win outcomes are at odds with the default status quo bottom line priority that are too often valued as the most important? How can this be navigated differently while still satisfying business owners and investors? In order for investors or business owners to make the shift to prioritizing people and purpose and principles first, what's needed for such an atypical shift? In today's world, these questions are often overlooked. And when they are, those interested in creating conscious business alliances and value-based initiatives and collaboration often end up finding out that they're slowly losing sight of what matters most to them, or they're pressured to ignore those values. These questions must be considered and new solutions sought, or the same win-lose behaviors and results are going to remain and continue ad nauseum. Questions must shift to what deliberations, strategies, lessons learned, and commitments must be considered, discussed, and agreed upon for successful outcomes that also support the well-being of everyone and everything, including our planet. My work at LifeWorks Systems means that these questions are about social interest, caring about the consequences that we cover. It's only with social interest that everyone can win. Who better to answer these questions and share the mindset and strategies needed than a principled, spiritually motivated investor who is creating a life, new systems, work, and a new movement that keeps these questions in mind and uses the answers to design everything that she does and to help others to do the same. So keeping all this in mind, let me tell you more fully about my guest today. I'm going to read her entire bio because it's important for you to know how powerful and accomplished this woman is, and how she has not only formed her convictions, but is a role model for how to live her convictions and her actions, which I think are quite impressive already. Meet Jenna Nicholas. Jenna is an investor, entrepreneur, advisor, coach, and speaker. She's the president of Enlightened Bottom Line, an investment and advisory firm. Enlightened Bottom Line is also the name of her new book, which we will be talking about. Jenna is also the co-founder and CEO of Impact Experience, which is focused on addressing equity across climate, healthcare, education, and investments. She's also the investment partner of One Planet Group that I mentioned, and she previously led the corporate development for One Planet Group, which incubates, operates, and invests in conscious, enlightened businesses. Jenna is an active angel investor and has invested in over 3 unicorns, including Lyft, Virta Health, and Isuzu. Jenna has worked with the World Bank Treasury on green bonds and other sustainability projects, and with Tonic, helping to support an impact investing community. She's worked closely with the Calvert Special Equities team, actively investing in companies and funds in the areas of education technology, financial inclusion, renewable energy, and sustainable agriculture. She previously led Divest Invest Philanthropy, a coalition of foundations that are shifting capital from investments in fossil fuels and reinvesting those in new economy solutions. Jenna spoke at a TEDx Portland talk that she gave about this work. And her talk is called Divest, Invest, and the Future of New Energy Solutions. The talk is incredible. I really recommend that you all go listen to it. It's about ideas, actions, and using our personal and organizational power to be part of a movement toward what is helpful and supports dreams for a bright and sustainable future and planet. I want to talk a little bit more just for a second about Jenna's talk. She talks about how she met Desmond Tutu at the age 12 and how that meeting shaped her decision to make a positive difference wherever she can. In her talk, she also presents why and how to be intentional about the kind of world we want to create and the systemic changes and collaborations that are needed to make our world safer, ethical, and caring. Because of her purpose-driven and committed choices, she has been building bridges with the most powerful world leaders on the critical shifts that are needed and how to invest in them and deliver them. Jen is also an advisor to the Nexus Global Youth Summit and Ethic, an online impact investing platform. Jenna graduated from Stanford University with an international relations honor degree, during which time she also read international development at Oxford University. Jenna is a Stanford graduate of the School of Business MBA graduate, a PD Soros Fellow for New Americans, recipient of the Stanford Social Innovation Fellowship, an Echoing Green Fellow, a Forbes 30 under 30, and by the way, she still looks like she's under 30, for social entrepreneurship, a Summit Fellow, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a coach for the Roddenberry Foundation, and a Young Leaders Council member of Millikan Institute. Oh my gosh, I'm not even quite done yet. I'm almost done. If you feel like you've been doing a lot, you might want to step up your game because Jenna is setting the tone here. Jenna has also served on the investment committee of the Wayfarer Foundation. She also served on the Impact Advisory Committee for Apollo Global Management. She co-taught a course, I'm not going to say this right, Tsinghua School of Economics and Management in Beijing, China, on business ethics, sustainability, and impact investing. Jenna also co-chaired the Emerging Leaders Council of LISC, a community development finance institution that has invested over $1.5 billion into community development projects. She's the vice president of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs, a community of over 1,500 entrepreneurs and investors. She's also an active member of the Baha'i Faith. And to just kind of finish this out for an aside, those of you who don't know of the Baha'i Faith, the Baha'is, I'm a friend of many Baha'is, and I deeply appreciate them. I know it's behind a lot of who Jenna is. The Baha'is believe that every faith is valuable and that every person in every faith deserves to be honored. Their greatest spiritual principle is the oneness of all humanity. So with all of that said, I'm so excited to welcome Jenna Nicholas, like St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, Jenna Nicholas to my show. Welcome, Jenna. How you doing?
Wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much. I'm doing great today.
Yeah. Well, would you tell us in your own words a little bit more about where you are right now in your personal journey? I know your TED Talk is still so relevant, but that was about 10 years ago. So I'd love for you to help our listeners understand where you are now And if you want to even talk a little bit about your new book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be here. So, in terms of right now, I have been doing a lot of work over the last few years, investing, as you referenced, investing in socially responsible businesses and funds, acquiring companies. And I'm really in the sort of next frontier of that work in terms of deepening my investment and acquisition work, a lot in the areas of climate, healthcare, and education, and also do a lot of work through our work with Impact Experience in really building bridges between investors, entrepreneurs, communities that have been overlooked and underestimated, whether that's in Montgomery, Alabama, or New Orleans, or other communities. And the work that you referenced that I talked about in the TED Talk, where we built a coalition of 140 foundations representing about $50 billion in assets under management that was shifting capital from fossil fuels into new economy solutions, continues to be a big part of my work in terms of working with families and institutions to align their values with their investments. And as you referenced, a big part of the inspiration for me for really my whole life has been the Baha'i faith, and particularly how do we put our spiritual principles into practice in terms of our work and life. And this is really a big part of the inspiration for me for putting together this book that I've been working on, Enlightened Bottom Line. And I launched a podcast last year where I've been interviewing people that have really been thoughtful and intentional about how they look at the role that their spiritual values play in shaping their investment and business decisions. And the power, and particularly given everything that's going on in the world, of really being intentional about, in the Baha'i writings, we talk a lot about the idea of leaving a trace, and the idea of thinking about what is the trace that we want to leave, and how do we invest the time to really reflect on the questions around legacy and what that looks like. So really the purpose with the book is to glean many of the insights from many of these luminaries, as well as insights from my own personal experiences, to be a set of tools and frameworks that people who are interested in integrating some of these principles more deeply into their lives have a roadmap for being able to look at ways to do that.
Yeah, it's so difficult right now. Like, you really have your work cut out for you. I know you said in your TED Talk, this is a conversation that's not going to go away, but there are certainly forces trying to oppress it. And so I admire and appreciate your courage and continuing forward. And what is so necessary about what you just described is giving people a path, giving people stories where they can say, oh, if someone else could do it, then I can do it. Because if we don't see success, we can't envision ourselves getting there. And to know that you can be both successful and helpful and valuable as a business, but also follow those, not have to sell your soul is the way I say it. It is about values. And so I very much appreciate that is part of your work, is to get the word out of those role models, those luminaries. And I love how you called having a trace. I hadn't heard that, but it's legacy. And you want to be able to provide the legacy. Are there any stories that you could tell me that are either in the book or that you know from your own life, of that shift of what we call power over and under to power within and between, where people are using their power to be creating beautiful things between people? The stories themselves would be so appreciated if you have any that come to mind.
Well, definitely in terms of this sort of power between, one of the tools that we use within our work at Impact Experiences, we start each of the experiences that we have with everybody sharing a symbol or an object that has significance to them. And we have people different race, gender, religious, social and economic, political backgrounds. And really a big part of the goal is how do we build bridges across differences? And we find that when we create this space for people to share a subject that has significance to them, it creates an opportunity for people to connect beyond any of their professional roles or ideologies to actually, what does it mean to be human underneath all of those layers? And it's powerful. Time and time again, we see people building these relationships and building the opportunity to build power with, as a result of really being able to see people's humanity and to move beyond the preconceived notions and biases that people have. A lot of the animating influence behind much of the work is really looking at the $82 trillion that exists within the asset management industry, and less than 2% being invested into women and people of color run companies and funds. And I think a big part of the way that we go about creating this shift in those power dynamics is by the rehumanization of other people. And so that's a big part of the book, is also elevating the ways that we can go about doing that and the power of what can come about when we go about doing that.
Yeah. So let me just comment on a couple things you've said and then ask you some more questions. One of them is I love that the Baha'i faith honors men and women working together, that it's described as the two wings of the bird, and that the bird can't fly without both wings in good order. And I also love how you talked about how you help people connect by sharing a symbol, because it kind of just takes us down to the bottom line root of who you are at your best. So one of my questions to you would be, what is your symbol? And I'd also just like to share what I think of when you said that, like, what would my symbol be? And for me, I listened to a talk one time about how some of us are here to be commandos in the love revolution. And so if I had a tattoo, which I don't, that's what I would have. It would be my symbol saying commando in the love revolution. And I think you are as well, Jenna, whether you are aware of it or not, you are. And you're bringing about the peace that the Baha'i community is holding that could start and originate and grow from the United States, I believe. So what is your symbol when you think of yours?
I love that. So I switch up my symbol depending on what I feel called to in the moment. But what I feel called to in this moment, and a symbol I've come back to a lot, is actually the necklace that I'm wearing right now, and it says "I love you, Mum." And I was raised by my mother, and my mother sadly passed away a number of years ago. But this is a necklace that I got for my mum a while ago, and I wear it every day. And mum was really the first person to kind of expose me to the Baha'i faith. She had an incredible life journey of learning about the Baha'i faith in her 20s, and really dedicating a lot of her life to serving people and communities. And so learning about the Baha'i principles from her, but also just learning about being a human being. And she always, both her and my grandmother, really inspired me to believe that anything is possible, and that when we set our minds to it, that anything, we can achieve anything. And I think to your point about the sort of commando of love, I think that's a big part of the principles that they help to infuse within me. So I very much believe on a spiritual level that continue to be guided by, many of those who have passed on, including my mother. So it's definitely a big source of inspiration for me to feel the power from this perspective of love that can kind of come from tuning into that love from my mom. So that's a symbol that I often come back to.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a very personal, and I love that because it humanizes your experience. I lost my mom when I was 21, so I really understand, and I talk to her all the time. And
Mm,
so I think also one of the things when you talk about your mom and your grandmother, I know this isn't a show that's just about women winning or women rising, but I think it is an important facet of creating a new kind of dynamic, is women rising, because we are so kind of foundationally less using power as power over and domination. And I read a really good book called The Power Code. I think you probably know Caddy Kay, maybe
mm.
Claire Shipman. I'm not sure if you know either of them, but they wrote that book. Positions of CEO or executive level positions is because we have a distaste for using power over people in general. We haven't been as conditioned to go for that zero-sum game. And so I love it that you're not only such an accomplished woman, but you are a role model in the world today. So I really appreciate that. And the fact that your mother and your grandmother were also role models to you, because we need more of that so that we can bring in that new way of using power. And so I very much appreciate that. Any other stories that you'd like to share from your book, or any other key principles that you think are important that maybe most people out there wouldn't have even considered? I love the idea of an enlightened bottom line. So, what are your thoughts, if you have any, on that? Or we can move on to something else.
Sure, no, happy to share some reflections. One principle that's arising for me as we're talking from the Baha'i writings is the idea of the forces of disintegration and integration in the world. So there's a sense that it's so often, I think, particularly with the media and so much of the orientation right now is where we see the ramifications of the forces of disintegration, right?
Mhm.
And yet at the same time, and you reference this with sort of some of these amazing initiatives around the role of women and other initiatives that exist that I think are really great examples of the forces of integration. And part of the idea, and certainly a lot of what I reference in the book, but is also a big part of my life and work, is what is that process for actively cultivating those forces of integration, and what is the ripple effect of when we double down and invest in those forces of integration and initiatives that are achieving goals around integration that can then really have a positive impact, and then also in reshaping and shifting what we think is possible. And I think that this kind of cultivation of hope, particularly in this moment, becomes even more important than ever.
Yeah, I love it that you're talking about both disintegration and then that reforming, that
Mm.
restoration. We do that a lot in the work that I do. In fact, we call it uh, getting comfortable with the disintegration. We call it spitting in the soup of what needs to disintegrate. So in our work, the soup we're spitting in, which means, it's a phrase from the psychiatrist that we use, his work, Alfred Adler. It means taking something that's perceived as wholesome and making it not so appealing so that people are willing to loosen their grip on it. And for us, that means that at the base of all struggles in the world is a feeling of inferiority. And that comes from having really negative and limiting beliefs about people, and then having systems that reinforce that about people. Like, I'm going to dominate you. I've got to control you as a manager. I've got to, or as a parent, even, I've got to, do it or else kind of mentality. Or I'm going to dangle carrots in front of you to get you to do what I want, because basically I believe you're selfish and lazy unless I motivate you. Or I'm going to praise you, or I'm going to criticize you so that you can feel my bestowing of that on you, and that's going to somehow force you to become this good citizen. And when we need to disintegrate those systems and but if we don't have something to restore with, then it's so easy to fall back on those status quo behaviors and systems. What I saw in everything I read about you is that you're a systemic change person. You're a systems thinker. So when you think about what systems need to disintegrate and what needs to be put in place, like in place of control, we say bring in a responsibility-based model where you believe people are great. And then you can create the conditions in which they act great. And then you are committed to helping them take responsibility for things like managing their relationships, managing their productivity, managing their engagement. Look at how Desmond Tutu played such a role in your life, because he was doing all of that, right? He had that system of personal responsibility, and it inspired you. So we'll take a short break, but when we come back, Jenna, I would love to hear more about what you are really clearly aware needs to disintegrate, and what are the things that need to be put in place instead, because that helps paint the vision for our listeners. Does that sound like a good plan?
Sounds great.
Okay, well, we'll be back soon. Welcome back, everyone, to this episode on commitment to an enlightened bottom line and how that ensures that everyone wins, with my guest, Jenna Nicholas. And before the break, Jenna and I were talking about the idea of how important it is in some ways to even welcome disintegration, because if we don't disintegrate the systems that have caused all the problems we have to begin with, how will we ever have room, space to restore something better? And Jenna is going to just, give us some stories about what are the things she believes need to disintegrate and be put in place instead, and anything that she's experienced about that.
Wonderful. I really appreciate this question. I think it's something that it's really important to reflect on at a kind of individual, organizational, and societal level. And some of the ideas that emerge for me is, I think, the idea that is often baked into capitalism around extraction. So I think that we've too often thought of investments as fundamentally coming from a place of extraction and extraction of wealth and wealth accumulation as an end in and of itself, but really that there's an opportunity. And I think that many people that are working within this area of social responsible investing or restorative economics is really looking at ways in which we can structure investments that aren't extractive, but are really both generating great financial returns, but also having a meaningful social and environmental impact, and that the two don't need to be mutually exclusive. So the reconceptualizing of how we think about investments and fundamentally how we think about capitalism becomes a really important aspect of that. And I mentioned earlier about the number of the $82 trillion and less than 2% being invested in women and people of color run companies and funds. I think that that's a really important kind of manifestation of many of the challenges that we see within our investment ecosystem. I think the disconnect between many investors and communities that have been overlooked and underestimated is another one where we can begin to think about how do we systems, and that's certainly been a big part of much of my work that really builds with communities rather than for or over. And I think that a lot of what we were talking about earlier around just the idea around the living trace, that I think what can come about when we consider what is the ripple effects of the actions that we take, and that we can't just think about the actions that we take in isolation, but that we are all part of an interconnected system, and that through taking more of a systems approach, we're able to more effectively deal with many of the challenges that we see in the world right now.
Yeah, Jenna, what's so interesting, and I don't know if you know this fact, but only 8% of the population are systems developers and thinkers. I believe you are one of them. I know I'm one of them. And what happens when you're a system developer is you see that interconnectedness. You see the whole puzzle. You don't just see the little part that is, pertaining to one person. And I love how you talked about moving into looking at financial and profitability and businesses from a generative and meaningful context, as opposed to an extraction, which is kind of a scarcity mindset. And I think it's so short-sighted. I see it in my work in bringing in a really different kind of shared power, purpose-based kind of culture model, that it's very short-sighted when an organization doesn't see the value of that. Because if people don't feel intrinsically motivated to give their best because they see the meaningfulness of the mission of the company, for example, and they feel the generative nature of the leaders in wanting them to be successful and wanting them to be free to operate as they best can, their most expanded capacities. If they don't recognize the importance of people and purpose principles, they're kind of cutting off their own nose to spite their face. It's like a really short-term idea of, I saw that in Crossing the Desert. It was like, let's just wander out of the way and make as much money off of this as we can. And then if it closes down, so be it. It was just like such a waste. And so I love it that you about bringing forth models that are generative, meaningful. They're not scarcity minded. They have belief in people. They believe in abundance mentality and wellness in a way, right? So do you have any stories about what kind of systems you have seen that have started to bring in that more generative way of functioning?
Yeah, I'd love to share an example of an investment that I made in a company called Isuzu, and it's a company that's both been doing extremely well financially. I actually refer to them in the book. Amazing co-founders that really driven by their personal experiences that they had as in the challenges within the housing system growing up, and that they formed this company to really address the challenges that many people have in terms of paying rent and access to housing. And they've really been able to build a model that has both been doing extremely well financially, but also really serving the lives of so many people that otherwise wouldn't have been able to have secure housing options. And I think it's been really interesting to see, and they're both really animated by their own personal and some sort of spiritual values as part of the work that they're doing there. And I think we see that with a number of companies that are really these shining lights of an ability to be able to be so committed to the social and environmental impact that they're seeking to have, constantly keeping in mind who are we ultimately serving, and with that also bringing in these models for being able to then also generate financial returns, so that it becomes less of a conceptual idea, but we see practically how are these companies being built, how are they treating their employees, and how the communities that they work in. And so I think the more that we can see those types of examples, the more inspiring that can be for budding entrepreneurs to be able to see a platform and a paradigm for how to do that differently.
I love that. I absolutely love it, because what you're describing is what we call social interest. It was another theme of Adler's psychology. And it is that we are in kinship with one another, and that we are responsible to look at what we're causing one another. And when that concept of social interest was brought into prison systems, where the repeat reincarceration was like 65 to 70% nationwide, where it was brought into prisons and taught to people, the recidivism rate went down to 4%. And yet there are people that don't really even teach social interest. I'm absolutely certain that the Baha'i faith does teach it in their own way, because every Baha'i I've ever met has been so caring about others. And it's what we need more than ever. And especially right now in housing. Like, I love that example, because housing right now is kind of being taken over by a lot of profiteering. And so to be able to create an organization like you're describing, that keeps in mind the factor of humanity and care for one another, is so critical to even the physical survival of people, that they're not out on the streets and possibly dying from not having what they need. So I love that. Any other thoughts that you want to share before we move on to a new question?
I think I'm good for now. Thank you.
Okay. So when you look at what you've been doing, do you see what are some of the short and long-term outcomes that you have found from people that don't have an enlightened bottom line and people that do have one? Do you have any kind of like research that you bring in around some of that?
Yes. So one of the things that's really interesting, kind of related to what we were just talking about, is that sometimes there's this preconceived notion that by investing through a lens around considering the social and environmental impact, that has to be a trade-off with financial returns. And there's actually, really good research that shows that that isn't necessarily the case, and that there are actually really great examples of companies and funds that have taken a real intentional lens in terms of the consideration of their social and environmental impact, and are also generating great financial returns. So I think that's one really important misconception that needs to be and can be sort of reconceptualized. I think
Yeah.
the other part is that the idea that this sort of operating from a place of purpose is a choice that we can all make. And I think so often people think, oh, well, that's only some people can think about that, and like that's not relevant for me. But the idea that actually this is something that we can all go about, and that the power of what that can what that can do in terms of even addressing challenges around mental health. So I think about research like Jonathan Haidt's book around the anxious generation and the increasing challenges around mental health, and particularly amongst young people. And I think in many ways, a lot of what we're talking about can be a response to a lot of these challenges that we're seeing in terms of the increase around mental health challenges, because the more that people can be grounded in purpose and to be attuned to their why, and to be sort of manifesting from the place of tuning into their why, that both leads to greater fulfillment and happiness and contentment, and that again the sort of ripple effect that can come from that. And that's also a big part of the reason that we designed impact experience in the way that we did, is that to really have the power of communities, and that particularly in harder moments, that having people have the opportunity to connect more deeply. And I reflect a lot on a line from one of our board members and mentors that she talks about how character isn't created, but it's revealed during times of challenge. And I think a lot of what we're seeing right now are the ways in which that sort of character is being revealed and the importance of that.
I love it. Purpose is number one in the LifeWorks Systems company. In fact, our purpose is to create a world where all people love their lives. And I remember, Jenna, when I was first telling marketing people about that purpose, they would say to me things that just were really sad, like, "Oh, you can't lead with that purpose because business owners don't care if people love their lives." And I'm like, I finally just said, you know what? I don't want to work with those businesses then, because if we don't care about people and how they feel and how they're living their lives, then they don't feel a sense of meaningfulness with us. Why should they care about our organization if we don't care about them? But what's also been really interesting in our culture transformation work, we used to bring in this one session in the fourth month out of 14 months on building your own purpose and your own core values, not building it, but identifying it. Because in our world, your purpose is who you are at your best, your highest spiritual calling. And yet most people are terrified to put their stake in the ground for that. And even companies, they're afraid of being thought of as too mushy, like, oh, I can't say I want to create a world where people love their lives. Like, what kind of mission is that? But that's the kind of mission people will rally behind, because they know that not only do you want to help your customers love their lives, but you want them as employees to love their lives. And so what's often difficult is for us to help people understand that if you don't do that first, you won't connect the dots to anything else internally motivating to people. And they're not going to feel as important if you don't have a meaningful why, and if you don't help them have a meaningful why. And so when we do purpose in our organization, we make sure that people can represent it like you do with the symbols. We have them do it at every meeting in a new and different way. Maybe they'll do a poem, or they'll do a song, a piece of a song, or they'll show, like one of my people recently did one where he showed a little mini video clip of kids dancing all goofy and crazy and saying, if we don't let loose and be childlike, sometimes we can't love our lives, And another person took a bunch of pictures of what was meaningful in their life and had a little collage. Because if we don't make those things relevant, and we don't make them here and now, and we don't make them important, we can't hold even a purpose as having very much meaning. And I know I'm saying a lot instead of asking a lot, but I just want you to know I totally agree with that. And when you are doing this nurturing kind of thing about purpose, and you're considering what is now almost taboo to talk about, which is the diversity, equity, and inclusion of people, that is what is strong. You talked about statistics that show that companies that take those things into consideration can win and are winning. And yet they're almost talked about as though they're a deficit. And I think that's just because the win-lose environment is holding on with a death grip to power over, power under, instead of win-win. And so if we can show that win-win works, it can create greater wealth for everyone, and it is an abundance mindset, and be able to prove it in the numbers. That's what is so helpful. And I think that's what you're saying as part of your book, is showing that an enlightened bottom line does not have to mean that you're suffering and poor. A lot of people think nonprofits are suffering and poor, and many of them are not if they're doing their business well. So I know I'm saying a lot, but is there anything else you would like to say about that notion of purpose or meaning?
I think that there's a lot of research also that comes out from Pew and McKinsey and Deloitte that shows that many people are not satisfied in their work environments right now. And we talk a lot about this in the book, also around the challenge of, and we saw this increase with COVID, and just the disconnect that often people have within the work environments, and sometimes even the lack of trust that exists within work environments, that it feels like now more than ever, the importance of really creating these spaces to see the intersection between our personal sense of purpose, the organizational purpose, what does that mean in terms of how we view what's going on in society. And so, very much resonate with the idea of purpose being at the center, and the creating intentional spaces for people to be able to identify what purpose means for them, and that also recognizing that that may evolve over time, and that it's not a static concept, but really something that has to be nurtured. And on a personal level, I host these discussion groups at my home and often on themes like on purpose. And we just had one on abundance and new beginnings. And I find that particularly having these spaces for people to connect, that where people have an opportunity to really reflect on what's coming up for them as they think about purpose, ways in which they feel connected to their purpose, ways in which they feel disconnected from purpose, becomes something that then can be a fuel for whatever it is that they want to do and how they want to be spending their time.
Yeah, I love it that you said it's a process. It doesn't happen immediately. I love it that you referenced McKinsey Health Institute, I'm assuming, and also the Pew data, because we have, if for the listeners, if you're interested and you want this, we have a very lengthy McKinsey Health Institute article about mental health and burnout within organizations, and how a lot of times the solutions are real surface level, like just bringing in ping pong tables or massage therapists or whatever, but it's really about transforming toxic workplace culture. And that if we don't do that, which is just a start to focus on purpose, then how do you create the concepts and the terms and the tools and the processes for living into that purpose, and make sure that people have the support systems? That is why there is so many people suffering from mental health issues. In one of Adler's concepts that we promote is this notion of how do we overcome inferiority complex. Brene Brown, you probably know her work. She calls it shame. It's the same thing that Adler was talking about with inferiority complex. And it's at the root of every problem we face. The internal mental health issues like anxiety and stress and depression and suicide and disengagement and all that goes on within us, obesity, all of that. And then also what we do to one another is all the isms, all the misbehavior, all the war, all the I'm right, you're wrong, all the I win, you lose, all comes from feeling like we don't understand how to reverse the systems that cause us to feel so bad about ourselves. And a lot of times what happens, I think, is that people blame themselves instead of saying, well, what system needs to be put in place that would fix this? Because if we don't not only have the tools and the concepts, but the support, it just isn't going to happen.
That's for sure. That's for sure. And the reinforcing feedback loops to be able to see, did that work? Did that not work? And not just the assumption that because something was experimented with, that it's definitely going to be the answer, but rather having that prototype mentality to keep iterating and building over time becomes really important.
Yeah, yeah. And the sad part, in a way, in our societies is that we are often kind of a fast food type mentality about transformation. And it's just like when somebody's 50 pounds overweight, that's not going to go away overnight. It takes time and it takes a real strategy and it takes support. And so I do think I love what you talk about, continual improvement and reinforcing and being able to show successes along the way. So what are the things that you would want to share with our audience, since we're getting a little close to the end of this, that are about how to cultivate things like you're describing? You're describing some of the meetings that you're having that are meaningful, using symbols, the conversations that you've been having with people. Is there anything that you would like to share that is additionally what you would recommend to the people listening about cultivating that social interest, that kinship, that sense of what we're all here for? What are your last thoughts on that?
Well, one thought I mentioned earlier briefly around the podcast that we have, it's Enlightened Bottom Line. I would really recommend people checking that out, and you can access it just through my website, jenna-nicholas.com. And it's just been really great interviewing people that are really engaging around a lot of the topics that we're talking about today. And many have really tangible examples from their lives about how they've gone about addressing a lot of these topics that we're talking about around purpose and spirituality within their organizations and work. So would really recommend checking that out. And of course, the book, once it comes out as well, and can sign up on the newsletter to get notifications around that. I also think that sometimes with some of these ideas, it can seem so overwhelming that it's like, where do we even start? And I think in many ways, rethinking about just what are the small steps and experiments that can be taken today. And that might be as simple as some journaling around some of these topics and really taking the time to reflect on what is it that's resonating and what are the conversations and people and work that where one feels elevated by engaging in that work, and what are other areas where maybe feel more draining, and just becoming more attuned to oneself and to other people, and to start having conversations with people around you about these topics, as it's likely that even if this isn't something that you typically talk about, that by creating that opening, that other people will really resonate with the space to be able to do that. And that's something that I've really found in many of my conversations in work. Many of the people that I've been interviewing and engaging with around these topics, I've been working with for many years, but this just hasn't been something that we've necessarily talked about. And once that space is created, it's pretty amazing the stories that people have to share, and also how appreciative people are of that opportunity to really reflect on what is most important to them and what drives them, and be able to be in community around that.
Yeah, I think people are hungry for that. It's so interesting because I actually literally prayed for a tribe where I could go deep into those kinds of conversations for myself personally, because I do it with customers, but I wanted more in my own life. And that's when my Baha'i friends showed up and said, "Hey, we have this group and we want to talk on deeply on subjects that really matter. And we want to call it deepening connections." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, how awesome is that?" I would like to backtrack because we have a little more time, and I would like to backtrack a little bit and ask you this question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. But what are some of the things that you've experienced? Because I know I experience this all the time, of pushback against this win-win philosophy that you are also embracing, this living by principles. And how have you coped with that, where you've seen that happening?
I think that what's interesting about pushback is that sometimes it can be even in our own minds, our own pushback, our own sense of fear, or the internalized sense of insecurity. So I think that's sort of one area, is also just acknowledging when we think about pushback, how much of that are our own internal narratives versus the
Yes.
actually being critiques that are coming externally. And and I think coming back to what we were just talking about before in terms of the journaling and being in community. I think part of the work around this, I think a lot about a dear friends that I also write about in the book, Julian and Kim McQueen, that started a company called Innisfree Hotels, and they've been really intentional about reflecting on culture and within their company. And they have, as one of their cultural principles, they talk about the idea of checking your paranoid fantasies. And the idea here, and they talk about it in the context of a work environment, is we can build these preconceived notions around, oh, well, somebody just did this or did that. What do they mean? And rather than building that narrative in our minds, actually the importance of being able to connect with that person and to engage around, hey, this is what I thought when you said that. Is that what you meant? And I think that that concept has ripple effects, not just within the organization, but within society at large, within our own conceptions of ourselves. And so I think that's sort of one area to really think about, is how do we engage with those setbacks? I think a lot about, Thomas Edison, that invented the light bulb. He had 100 failed mistakes in inventions before he designed the light bulb. But what we don't think about the 100 failed attempts, we think about the final light bulb that was invented, right? So the idea that actually also, how do we reconceptualize failure and roadblocks as actually potentially being tools that lead us closer to the final outcome of what it is that we're designing and building.
I love that answer. I love how you talked about a lot of this resistance and pushback is within us. And that when we uncover it within ourselves and learn how to address that, then we have a story to tell people to help them learn to look at their own. It's a level of enlightenment. You even talked a little bit earlier about noticing and sharing in the journaling, etc. I think a lot of it even comes back down to dropping below our intellect into our bodies and recognizing what our bodies are telling us about what doesn't feel right. and what does feel right. And it's absolutely true. Like I see a lot of pushback to this win-win kind of culture model we bring forward, but it often reflects where I am overcoming. I do the work partially for my own development, my own growth, but also to keep bringing people forward that also want to move in this direction. And yet you talked about checking your paranoid, I don't know if you called it
Fantasies. Yeah.
fantasies, right? I love that phrase. I might write an article called Checking Your Paranoid Fantasies because, and also checking out when we're assuming a negative intention from somebody. We make so many negative assumptions. We call them unresolved psychological contracts. We just, if something doesn't go the way we think it should, we automatically think, well, this person has a devious mindset. And yet you're saying, check it out. Find out that it's not devious. Find out that you don't have enough information to judge that person in a negative way, which then contributes to your own paranoid fantasy, right? So I love what you're talking about because you're really talking about enlightened people, not only an enlightened bottom line, but enlightened people. Any final words on how people can reach you, Jenna, that you want to share here? And then we'll go ahead and just wrap this up.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the opportunity here. And please reach out to me on LinkedIn, through my website, the Jenna Nicholas. That website's jenna-nicholas.com. And really look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, me too. I mean, we started out by really talking about the commitment to an enlightened bottom line. And what we're really looking at is the commitment to an enlightened life and a commitment to everyone winning by becoming enlightened. And Jenna, what I am so impressed with you about is the fact that you are a living, breathing, walking, doing role model for that in the world. And my hope is that everybody really researches you and researches all the things that you're involved in, and maybe even just looks into the Baha'i faith, not necessarily to convert to it, but to understand that there are people that have spiritual values that believe in the oneness and to give respect to everyone in their differences. I mean, I love it that the Baha'is aren't allowed to convert people, because one of the biggest ways we cause struggle is trying to convert people and fix them and change them as though they're somehow inferior. So I really appreciate that you are living an enlightened life, but that you're tying it to people having enlightened bottom lines in their life so that they can attach success financially with success in living a life where their soul expands and isn't sold. And for that, I am super grateful to you, and know that your book and your work and all of the things you have done and all the things you will do are going to bring about enlightenment for many other people. And I thank you for that. And I just invite our listeners to keep coming back and listening to people like Jenna Nicholas, who can bring a positive story to the world that will fuel the peace that we all want for a win-win society, a win-win individual, and a win-win set of businesses. Thank you very much. You've been listening to When Everyone Wins, where we're shifting power over and under to power within and between. I'm Judy Ryan, your transformation talk radio host. Tune in each second and fourth Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time to learn new concepts and tools and listen to conversations I have with thought leaders and change agents. You'll also see real-world applications of what I'm covering so that you experience the power of the concepts and tools I share. In each episode, I bring you my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder and CEO of LifeWorks Systems. I invite you to call in with your unique stories and questions. The path to ensure that everyone wins depends on our ability as people to create a life we love and help others do the same. For more information, visit lifeworksystems.com.